Just so I get it on tape, your name is Joan Emory.
Mm-hmm.
And you were born where?
In China.
In China. You were actually born in China.
Yes. Don't ask me how old I am.
I will not go there.
Good.
So your formative years were in China then, growing up as a little girl.
Right. My father was British and my mother White Russian.
And what did your dad do?
He worked for the Shanghai Power and Light Company, which was the utility company owned by an American firm. It gave power and light for all of Shanghai.
And was that, and what did your dad do with them?
He was an accountant. He did figures. And well, I don't know if you want me to go anywhere.
Well, I'd like to know about the people and who they were, your dad, yeah.
Well, perhaps I should begin with the war in 1937 when the Japanese started bombing and so forth.
Okay.
I was only a small girl, and you don't remember dates and names. What you remember are events, and I remembered that my mother was very frightened of the bombs falling and took us to hide underneath the stairs. And it seemed to me a game at first, being very small. But I remember that we kept a canary out on the porch, and it died from the concussions. Anyway, the men stayed behind in Shanghai, but my father bought passage for my mother and I to Hong Kong. The women and children were evacuated then. And he could only get us third class. There was such a crush of people going. And I remember traveling third class to Hong Kong. I still have nightmares of horrible bathrooms and food coming down a table, soup spilling in my lap. So it must have been pretty bad. But when we got to Hong Kong, there was no place for us to stay. And my parents were young, they didn't have much money. But people donated houses, and we stayed on a house on the peak. Somebody's house, some rich man's house. It was very beautiful. But I remember at that time there was a great hurricane. It was very eventful. But my memories are of waking up in the morning one morning and seeing my shoes floating on the floor. There was so much water in the room. But anyway, then we went back to Shanghai. The trouble subsided. I gather that the British gave the Japanese more concessions in the handling of the international concession, which was the international settlement, rather, which was owned by, well, there was English part and the French part. And so things went on for a while, but there were small tightenings. The war was going on, and in Europe it was beginning. And things were becoming harder to get. Shoe leather was hard. I remember my father had a pair of my shoes sold in automobile tire. And I remember thinking how terribly ugly they looked when I went to school. But now my granddaughter wears shoes just like it and thinks they're the height of style. And the other things were that gas became very hard to come by. And there were all kinds of adaptations in the automobiles. They were running them on alcohol and stuff like that, and suddenly everything was belching black smoke. But then my father didn't have a car to drive to work anymore, or they didn't send the chauffeur in the car, and he took to riding his bicycle to work. And he dropped me off at school, and I remember going through the crowded Chinese streets, sitting on the back of his bicycle and feeling very insecure because I didn't have very much confidence in my father's bicycle riding. And around that time, everyone was suddenly sporting string bags to carry their groceries in, because food also became and everybody would stop and buy groceries and stuff like that. Though we had servants, all foreigners then had servants, I guess more if you were wealthier and so forth. But you didn't run your household without servants in China, which were cheap enough to have. And I have remembered thinking to myself that I can now run my whole house, whereas my mother needed 3 servants to run the same thing, and I think I do it more efficiently. But anyway, about that time, then as it got on, they started rationing. And my father was in charge of the ration tickets for the Chinese workers who worked for the Shanghai Power and Light. And this were getting up to where the Japanese had already begun to take control. This was after Pearl Harbor. And somebody broke into the office and stole a lot of the coupon books and so forth. And my father was blamed for it, and the Japanese wrote a little thing on against his name. And the eventual way we were punished was that when our family went to concentration camp, we weren't allowed to get Red Cross parcels for a while. That was his punishment. Because, and of course, the theft of the ration tickets, the Chinese didn't need them to live on and so forth. When the Japanese had their war in 1937 and attacked Shanghai on the outskirts, they didn't come into the international settlement, but they raped China. They treated them terribly, and I remember that people started coming in. You saw more and more beggars. I've never seen people as hard up as the Chinese were, as broken and beaten down by fate. I've seen a woman begging on the street come up to the rickshaw. Her breast was bare and she was holding a baby to it, but the baby was blue, it was dead. I've seen children in the street with their stomachs swollen out with beriberi, because when I was first driven to school, it was down a market street, and you could see all these things. And you'd see children lying in the street, dead. There was no way to feed all those people, ever. And I remember one time when I was driven to school by a chauffeur, and I sat in the back, and I looked out at this market street where you'd see everything, food being sold, hogs being taken to market, and ducks hanging, the Peking ducks hanging in the window brown, and people having their ears cleaned and their teeth done, all out on the street, everything you could see there. But I remember having the thought as a child that there was no way anyone could ever get enough food to feed all these people and to see that everyone was all right. I thought to myself, not even God could do that. And it wasn't until many, many years later, when we were living in San Diego, and I went very late one night to one of those vast grocery stores, wandering down the aisles, and I was quite alone. There was music playing, and suddenly I realized that I'd found the food, that I knew where it was. Well, anyway, as I was saying, yes, the Chinese had all been driven into the international settlement and China because of the depredations of the Japanese, the terrible things the countryside raised and all that. And they were defenseless. There's no way to help them, and they were so poor, they had nothing. I remember seeing a fire plug with water dripping slowly, a drop at a time. And I've seen a line of 6 people squatting on their haunches, waiting with little buckets to fill them just to get water. They didn't have anything, you know. They slept on the street. Well, anyway, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the way we found out in China, in Shanghai, was they bombed the 2 ships that were in the harbor. One of them was an American ship and the other was a British. And the American ship, I think it was just a normal business.
Your transport ship.
Yeah, there were American sailors. I think it was called the Wake or something. I'm not sure. I know that the sailors were interned, but eventually some of them wound up in Lung Wah camp, but not right off. They were put there later on, and I remember that they came to Lung Wah camp. Well, the period after that became very troubled because the Japanese now had us in their clutches, but they didn't immediately put us in concentration camp. But they made it very difficult. That was when the rationing came out, my father. They would suddenly blockade the roads. And you might be going somewhere in a rickshaw or in a car, and then you couldn't. You'd have to sit in your car or rickshaw for 2 or 3 hours at a time, and then they'd open it up and let you through. There's no reason for it. It was just to show authority. And then we got this announcement that we would be sent to camp. Oh, and meanwhile, we'd already been told to wear armbands, and we had to wear a red armband with a number on it. And the British always liked to organize things, so there was an organization called the BRA, the British Residents Association, and they worked with the Japanese in arranging things and doing. And they were the ones who told us that we'd be going to concentration camps and so forth. I believe there were 8 camps in all, smaller ones within the city, but Lung Wah was the largest. It said there were around 6,000 British in Shanghai. A Lung Wah camp had 3,000 people in it. And there were very few Americans, a few missionaries, mostly British, but also Free French and Belgian. And there were some Jewish people, but only if you had a British passport. So there were a few Jewish people, but otherwise the Jewish people were not interned, only if they had citizenship, British citizenship. So, well, we were told that we'd have to get ready for concentration camp. And they sent us a notice. I have a copy of the notice if you want to see it. But it said that we could take our bedding and 2 suitcases each and dental stuff and like that. And immediately in Shanghai, of course, businesses spring up, and my mother just called up a packing company, and they came and packed our beds, and between the mattress and the springs, they put food and stuff like that. And then they wrapped it all in these. The Chinese are very efficient at wrapping things. And they were shipped ahead, taken up. And then we were told to report to the country club the next morning, and there everybody met. But I must say that before that had happened, that 3 Japanese came to our house. They'd already impounded our car, the family car, and they took that away. They sent it through a metal press. I hear that everyone who had their car, they mashed it in the press so your car became 3 inches high. They were very short of metal, and they intended to ship all these cars back to Japan to use to make airplanes. But as it happened, they didn't. So after the war, you could go and reclaim your 3-inch high car if you so desired. But that was what they did with those. And in the meantime, then they came to our house. There were 3 Japanese, all in uniform, with their long swords going down. And they itemized everything in our house of any value, wrote it down on a big piece of paper, and on everything they put a little sticker. I still have 2 little blue and white pots with a numbered on the bottom that they stuck there. Must have been very good glue because it never dropped off. And then you had to sign that you were now responsible for this property because it all belonged to the Japanese government. And if you got rid of it or sold it, they could, cut off your head or whatever. I mean, by then they were very frightening. And so in a way, we were almost glad to go off to camp because everything had become so frightening in the car. The food was short. Anyway, all right, we went to the country club, the former country club, sat there, and then buses arrived, and we got on them and drove off to Lung Wah camp. I remember sitting in the back of the bus with a bowl holding my small turtle in it, and I was thinking how stupid children are, because what on earth would you do with it? When I did get there, I released it into the pond. But anyway, that's what I went to concentration camp carrying, a little bowl with my turtle in it. And it was quite a drive because Lung Wah camp is not in Shanghai, it's out in the countryside. It's near the Lung Wah pagoda. And the airport is in the distance, not as close as it is in the movie that what's-his-name made.
Spielberg.
You're right. And I think the thing I have against that movie, by the way, is that he made so much of the Japanese Zeros and how great they were. He didn't say that they had been used to destroy Chinese colleges and make them into rubble, that they had destroyed the city of Suzhou, which was like Venice, all canals and built on it, and they just demolished that. They went after the history of China. They ruined everything they could. And that he didn't bring out. That's what they used their little Zeros for, and they had no opposition because the Chinese had no airplanes, and the country was broken up with warlords and so forth. Well, anyway, the airport was not that close as in the movie, but you could see it in the distance. Not that it had any planes or was used much then. The Japanese didn't use it for their planes much. Well, when we got there, Lung Wah camp was a former Chinese university. And as you see in the picture there, I don't know if it shows it, but it had been bombed by the Japanese too. And there were buildings in the center of it, 2 of them, that were complete rubble, just concrete and the rebar sticking out and so forth. And so that's why they could use it, because it was abandoned. But they had sent men ahead there because there was no water, and it wasn't really fit for use. They sent a truck in to bring us water, but the early men who came to Lung Wah built sheds and boilers where you could boil the water. I mean, you can't drink the water that comes out of China wells or creeks unless you want instant death, because it's just cholera and all kinds of things. So the water had to be boiled, and they set up these sheds, and there were the great big kongs where you'd heat the water, and then they had to do some work. I think we came in the third load of people. We went to camp in April of 1943.
Now, who all was with you from your family? Just you and...
My father and mother, myself and my younger sister.
So for your full family then? Mm-hmm. Okay. I didn't know if they separated you or not.
Well, as you see, because it had been a college, the buildings were dormitories. And they were just like a long corridors with these rows of small rooms. And there were, I think, in G block where we were, 6 rooms per side, so probably a dozen rooms on each side, and then that would be 24, probably 48 people, because it was only 2 stories. 48 families, I mean. And then once you got there, your beds were there, because the rooms were empty. All that was there was a light hanging from the ceiling with a bare bulb, and you were informed that if you plugged in any appliances, you could be, shot or dead and so forth. So I have a thing from my mother. Do you want me to read what she wrote about the camp?
Is it fairly short? If we have time at the end, I'll have you...
Yeah, okay. Well...
now, at this time, as a little... Because you were, 7 years old? Because you talked at one time hiding under the stairs with your mom, and you saw that as a game. At this point now, as a 7-year-old, is it changing that you realize this is scary? Or what? Do you remember what your perspective?
The Japanese frightened me when they came to our house. I've always been frightened of men in uniform ever since. Well, I'd also seen pictures of the Germans, and I was thinking that the way they dressed and the way they acted was frightening. But it's strange because the Japanese were very short. I think they were only about 5 feet tall. And they all had bow legs because Japanese women used to carry their babies on their back in like a sling. And they'd carry the males till they were maybe 2 years old. Well, with your legs stuck around your mother's back, you got bow legs, or maybe they also didn't take enough vitamin D, who knows. But the Japanese that I remember were about 5 feet tall, with bow legs, and a long saber sword that dragged behind it on the ground. And that's how they looked, with their little forage caps and their uniforms. And they were very fierce and frightening. But as for going into camp, no, for me it was in a way a bit of an adventure because I'd gone to an English school and I was kept very rigidly in place. So to go to concentration camp and to be able to play with children and run out and so forth. At first I thought it was wonderful, like going on a holiday. And there was things to do. We didn't have enough food to eat, and so people built chatty stoves. You get a can and you put some clay in it, and then you put bars through the middle, and then you'd go over to where they made these water boiling things, which were fired up with coal, and eventually, after using the coal, they'd put them on the pile of, and I remember they called it looking for clinkers, which you'd sit on this great big pile of used coal, and you'd look through for pieces that had bits of black in it. And then you'd carry them home to Daddy, and he'd put them in the stove. And I became, in a year or so, when I got hungry, my mother let me go and make pancakes on the chatty outside by myself. I don't remember how come I was so good at it, because I don't think I could do it any now, but I would make pancakes on the chatty and fry them, and we'd have them to eat. But we were always hungry. I remember going to bed and dreaming of food, because in the morning, the delivery of food came, the 2 they were inmates, they'd bring the food along in a sort of a wheelbarrow, and they were big kongs. For breakfast we had green tea and rice gruel, and we had more or less the same thing for dinner. And you did get worn down by there just wasn't enough nutrition. So people really wanted those Red Cross parcels. And you were always hungry, always thinking about food. And so, you'd get a bit of fat and do this flour and stuff up. But I think people had brought a lot of food and extras in their bedding and so forth. And at first, people were more fired up. Nobody believed the war would last 3 more years. Everybody said it would be over in 3, that, of course, the Americans and the British would beat these teeny little shrimpy Japanese by that time. No one understood that it would last so long. But it did, and I think by the last year, they were getting very desperate. There were fights among disagreements, and people didn't know, how it would all end and so forth. And at that time, it got bad. I remember the children all breaking out in impetigo, which is a skin disease. And the only thing to treat them was potassium permanganate. So I remember that everybody was covered with these large purple spots, from the permanganate solution and so forth. No, there wasn't anything we didn't have medicines and stuff like that. There were a couple of escapes, and the Japanese got very nasty after that. They punished the rest of us for that. But then I remember I only found out about this later on, but we had been forbidden radios, and in fact they were confiscated even before we went into concentration camp. You had to go over and hand over your radio to the Japanese authorities. But someone had taken a radio into camp. It was in D block, which was more or less where the upper class lived and so forth, and the older people and the people with money were in D block. And someone had taken in a radio, and it was supposedly hidden in a child's pull toy, so the Japanese didn't find it. So there was some kind of underground rumors and stuff would come out. But that's how we knew that Russia was holding out against Germany, and we were getting some news. And then we heard rumors that they had taken the people from Haiphong camp and moved them out. The Haiphong was in a smaller camp in in Shanghai. And then we were told that they were going to take us from Longhua and ship us to Japan, that we were going to be put around the airports to deter the Americans from bombing Japanese airports. They would be told that we were there. And we were told to get ready to leave. So then all at once and unexpectedly came the news of the atom bomb being dropped. And it was all at once that we only had very few guards, 15 guards, I think, because Longhua was out of the country. Out in the country. And also, I think Japan was short of fighting men, so our guards, except for the commandant, were young. I think one of them was only 19. And all at once they disappeared. They were gone within 2 to 3 days. And we were sitting out in the country by ourselves. And we heard that the road had been bombed. There was the road out there. So there wasn't any way to get back. And meanwhile, you'd lost communication with, who was there to communicate with? Everyone you knew was in camp with you. Well, and the villagers, the Chinese, had stayed far away from the camp while the Japanese were in control. But now they came to the gates and they brought greens and stuff, and people began to trade back and forth. And I must say that my mother, being very proud of her clothes and her looks and so forth, had gone into camp not with her box full of food, but with it full of clothes. And I was thinking, how can you eat clothes? Well, by the third year of the war, the girls who had gone in younger were now running out of clothes, and so were the other women. And my mother's clothes came in very handy, and she used them to trade with, and she traded them to Chinese villagers, bits and pieces. What they do with them, I don't know, but we were able to use her clothes to trade for bits of food. And then people drove out from Shanghai, and then arrangements were made where you had to hire somebody to take you back home again, which was hard when you had no money to speak of. But you know, things gradually came together. And in the meantime, since we had no food, the Americans flew over and they dropped parcels, food packages, out of their airplanes. Now, I remember that the parachutes were colored. To me, in my memory, they were all colors. But I know they were red. They were beautiful parachutes, red nylon with white ribbing, because one woman who was attractive, I think she was also white Russian, they cut them up afterwards, and you could bargain for pieces, and she bought a piece, and they said that she had a dress made and appeared at the club which had reopened in this parachute dress. But I mean, nylon was new to us, and we'd never seen it before, and it was fantastic. You know, you'd give anything for a piece of red nylon. So anyway, I remember still what was in those kits. They must have sent other things. They fell down, and they were in steel drums, and then the men would run out there from the camp and bring them in and all that sort of thing. And they were GI rations were in there too, and we eventually got a box with a can of butter. By that time, you'd begun to forget what bread and butter tasted like, and you thought, could I have ever eaten this delicacy? What was it like? And cake? No cake. No, never. So they were very foreign and different, and this was like eating food from an alien planet. And I remember that. And I always felt very, very grateful to America then for the food and this feeling that somebody cared. So we did eventually go back to China, and at that time we were still British citizens. And Britain remembered that we existed and gave us a free ride home to England. Of course, our house had been lived in by the Japanese family during the war. And when we got back there, all these things that we'd signed for were missing, stolen and gone, and it was in a state of disarray. And there didn't seem to be much to do except go off back to England. So we sailed on an English troop ship that hadn't been yet dismantled. And I remember the harbor was also mined still, so a destroyer went ahead of us in case we blew up, which my mother was praying all the time because she wasn't sure about all this. And I remember on our trip back to England, we went through the Suez Canal, and by that time there was an outbreak of chickenpox amongst the children, and my sister was very sick, and so we weren't allowed ashore. But they did allow us to get off at Suez at some day camp or whatever it was, which was handled by the Australian Red Cross. and we were taken ashore and treated to some kind of thing. And there was a table with donated items, pajamas, and another one was shoes. And I was eager by then to have some clothes. I remember I went and rooted a thing and got a pair of striped pajamas. And I found 2 pairs of shoes that I thought were so lovely and they fit. It wasn't until I got back to the ship that I found out they were both for the right foot. But I still have my Australian wool army blanket that the Australians, it's, you know, a soldier's blanket, and it says from the Australian Army. So they were very nice too, the Australians, and they suffered in World War II. They lost a lot of men also. And we did get to England, and then once we got to England, I remember riding through London and seeing how bombed it had been. They had a hard time there. And my mother's sister was there in Oxford, and they were all very glad to see us, because one thing that they did do for us, they gave us 3 years worth of ration coupons, since we've been without food. So our relatives welcomed us with open arms because we handed over all the ration tickets. And then we booked passage to America. And we went back to America. My father reported into his company, and what did they want him to do and so forth. And they did rehire him to go back to China, so he went back there. And eventually my mother and sister and I joined him back there again. In time, I went to school there at the Shanghai American School, and there was a nice couple of years or so forth till the communists started advancing. And I told my mother this time, I said, I don't want to sit out another war, you know, in a concentration camp. And she didn't want to leave, and my father wouldn't, but we left, we flew out, and then my father followed on the last ship to leave Shanghai. And after that, the communists had it. So,
was the time in the camp, was that because it sounds like your family was fairly well-to-do in the social structure, and then moving into the camp, I assume that broke the social structure to a certain extent. Was that tough on your father to be now a prisoner versus a businessman, or how did it affect the family in that way?
well, Britons believe in a stiff upper lip. And in a way, one felt they almost welcomed this adversity to show their stuff. I remember that in the dining room in the beginning, they have song fests, and you'd sing Row, Row, Row Your Boat and all this other stuff. When I was small, I went to a British school. My father wanted me to speak with an English accent and be very British. And every morning there, we sang God Save the King. So you see, one didn't give way under these sort of circumstances. And at first in the camp, the British women organized everything. We only had 2 bathrooms in the dormitories. There was G block. There was a ladies' bathroom was downstairs, and the men's bathroom was upstairs. In fact, our room was right next to it, and all night you'd hear the doors inside the men's room banging back and forth. And then there wasn't enough water. You had to flush the toilets with a dipper and that kind of stuff. It's in my mother's notes somewhere. And at first, people seemed to take all this in stride. And then the women organized, and they said that, you know, once a month you should clean the corridor, your section. And then there was also a big washroom, which was just like concrete sinks all around, and there you could go and either wash your clothes and so forth. There's no showers, no baths. It was just sponge bath. And that was your duty too. A woman had to do that, the floor, and then the washrooms, and then the ladies' toilet. And once a month you got one of those duties. And someone would come along and tell you, this is your thing, and so forth. Well, my mother didn't go along with it. Towards the end, she was saying that her wrist was hurting and so forth. She couldn't mop the whole corridor. She said she could mop the section in front of her door, but she couldn't mop a whole stone corridor with a huge mop and so forth. So there was a terrible fight. But she got her way, and then everybody ended up just mopping the little section in front of their door. It was hard because people didn't have much room inside the room, so they put their empty boxes right outside the door. So you had a corridor where you had to dodge all these boxes, suitcases and pile. Every room had its own little pile of suitcases outside it. So, you didn't have an open corridor to mop. And it was territorial in a way. So there was that. My mother broke the rules, you see. That wasn't the British way. You were supposed to do your best. And in a way, the women also welcomed the adversity. They gave up on their looks. They put their hair in pin curls and tied a handkerchief around it, and then they wore pants. They looked like hell, to speak of. But my mother's had naturally curly hair, and she couldn't iron her clothes, but she put her blouse under the mattress and her skirts to iron them, and she'd emerge with this curly hair and a nicely fresh pressed blouse or skirt. And the women hated her. You see, that wasn't in the right sort of thing, so that made trouble, but in the end it was all right. So,
what did they, you were there 3 years.
Well, almost 2 years, 8 months, I think, yeah.
What did you do all the time? Did they make you work, or?
Well, my father worked. He was, I remember in the winter, his hands were so cracked from working with lime. We had to do our own cooking. There were these big kitchens, and the meals had to be made for 3,000 people. That isn't done in a big thing. There was a carpentry shop. The rooms were bare and at first, and then they put shelves up to hold stuff. And then the Japanese did give us permission to plant, and then in the last year to even make separate individual gardens. They were kind of eased up then. And then they set up a school, and anyone who could teach taught. So I went to school. Maybe the teachers weren't all that great, but they hadn't been a teacher before. I remember I always liked to draw, and I sat in the back drawing, and I had a very volatile French woman I guess she was teaching French. When she saw what I was doing, she exploded, picked my books up and threw them out of the window. Well, so we had, but I was going to school then, and then they had Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and that kind of thing. And then there was a man who organized evening entertainments where they had little song fests and stuff like that. So they did all that.
So you've basically formed your own community. They put you in this compound, and then you recreated structure with it.
Oh, there were 2 Catholic priests in the camp, an older one and a younger one, and I remember that they volunteered to dig the drainage ditches, because we had open sewage running around, and that was no picnic, that job. And they dug those and stuff like that. There was a lot of work just in upkeep to do. And then there were the deliveries from the city of water and the food and all, and those had to be taken. And then somebody had to report to the guards on this and that, so forth. The men that escaped, it wouldn't have been easy to escape because there's nothing but empty countryside all around. Well, it was planted with stuff, but it's flat land and there's nowhere to go, really. Not easy. And of course, Shanghai itself was occupied by the Japanese.
What were the guards like? Did they keep the intimidation up the full time you were there? Or did it...
In the beginning, they were hard. They'd pull inspections in the middle of the night. And my mother, well, if some people left their children that were sleeping still in bed and didn't bring them to the door, and for that they got beaten up, slapped around, and so forth by the guards. The chief guard would wear white gloves, and he'd be very bossy and so forth. But that stopped. I think they must have realized that the war wasn't going their way, and they eased up after that. And then later on, I remember one of the younger guards even being friendly, that some of the girls were talking to him, and I remember listening to him and went nearer to him and seeing his sword and all, and he was telling us, he spoke some English. I remember his name, but he was saying that when they won the war, he was going to be governor of Los Angeles. I was wondering why America, not England. But by then, America was becoming more preeminent in the war and so forth. So, but then we had those American sailors in the camp too. So people had got to know, them and all that. So.
Do you hold an animosity towards the Japanese culture today, or was that war, or?
Yes, I do, because I don't think they've ever felt sorry for what they've done, and they were brutal. The stories I've heard. General Chenault of the Flying Tigers, after the war, he came to speak to the Shanghai American school students and so forth. But I'd heard of him before that, and I knew that many of the pilots who flew for him were Chinese. And if the Chinese pilots were ever caught or captured by the Japanese, there was a story of one that was. And to make an example of him, it was said that they put him in the village square, and they did him the death by inches, where they cut off little sections of your skin, an ancient Chinese torture that they do. So they made terrible examples of the Chinese who resisted. My mother had 3 sisters, and the youngest married an American man, and he worked for the OSS. Now, he got her out of China before the war, but he himself worked for the American government up in the one part of China that was never taken over. The name escapes me at the moment. That one part never fell to the Japanese. It's the city that's, well...
The geography's terrible.
Well, he worked with him. He was a radio telegraph operator, and he stayed there through the war and worked with the Chinese. And he talked about it afterwards. It was hard. The Chinese suffered very much under the Japanese. I guess they thought they could take over all of China. But they were so needlessly brutal because there was no resistance. It was just peasants and so forth. And how can you say that that's wonderful? They have been given their reparations. In America, every time the anniversary of the atomic bomb comes around, you hear this breastfeeding, how can we do this, and all this sort of stuff. Well, if that hadn't been done, many more American servicemen would have died, and maybe all the people in the camps scattered all over Asia and so forth would have been dead too. And why? Well, why wasn't it justified? I feel that it was. I don't understand why this breastfeeding, because I haven't seen other cultures beat their breasts, and certainly the English don't apologize for their little mistakes. And they've done some brutal things too. In the Boer War, which I'd never heard about in history, we just gloss over that. But when you read it, they did some nasty stuff to the Boers. And in India, they put down their rule very firmly. I read about in India where some local prince resisted, and I think they killed many of the British population, and the British came back, and this fort where they'd taken over and where they'd killed British women and children, that they brought in the men who'd done that, and they forced them to lick the floor and the blood with their tongues, because they knew that Indians have this thing of the purity of the body and so forth. But to teach the lesson that they couldn't kill British civilians that way. So they didn't. And of course the British also kept their a moral superiority, a moral ground. Americans are always trying to be nice, to be buddies. English have never tried to be buddies. They just tell you right off, you know, I'm better than you and you better know it. And it sort of comes across that way. And the Asians and many people, they don't appreciate someone who wants to be their buddy. They understand better the person who just has caste. Well, of course, the British have always been terrible snobs, so that's the way it is, yes. Mm.
Wow, what a, I guess fascinating isn't the best word for it, but the childhood that you grew up in and how it must have affected your whole perspective of life, those 3 years being imprisoned and having to survive through that, and the fear of all the things as a young child really not understanding. I would assume the idea.
Well, it's nothing I ever talked about. All children ever want is to be like everyone else. And when I went to the Shanghai American School, I wished that I'd been born in America and could come from someplace like one of those exotic Kansas or Wichita or whatever. You know, to me that was very exotic. And I never talked about camp very much to anyone, because children don't want to be different. They want to be part of the crowd.
That's where you talk about, and again, your age growing up and the shoes, and when the rationing started and your dad having to put the tire soles on your shoes. Again, now that makes you different all of a sudden, you know, but everybody was in that.
Well, I always felt different because my mother was White Russian. And in the Chinese, Shanghai community, that was definitely put you on a lower class. When my father told my grandmother that my English grandmother, that he was going to marry a White Russian girl, she said that she'd just as soon see him dead at her feet, because White Russians had a very, very bad reputation. The irony of it was that my Russian grandfather was of a much higher class than my English grandparents. He spoke 5 languages, and he was the head of the Imperial Russian Telegraph Service in Tehran, Persia, at the time that the communists first took over. And my mother herself had a very fascinating, because they had to leave Tehran at night and go over those mountains and end up in Baghdad. And in Baghdad, which was then presently, the British had conquered Baghdad in World War I. They fought their way up from Basra at tremendous odds, and they were then organizing stuff anyway. They took all these refugees and eventually were going to ship them back to White Russia, which was still owned on the other side, past China. But my folks got, my mother and her father and all, they got off in Shanghai. And when there were, and many other White Russians came to Shanghai, there was a big community of them. They also thought they could go back one day, but that didn't happen. By the time my grandfather came to Shanghai, they were penniless. They had no money at all. Shanghai was full of other White Russian refugees. And many of the White Russian girls, they were very beautiful, but there was nothing for them to do. They became whores and taxi dance girls, and so they got a terrible reputation. So, but it was unavoidable, and once they were in China, they couldn't get out because they had no passport. You could get what was called a Nansen passport, which was issued to people without any statehood, but that wasn't easy. And in China, as I said, you saw beggars everywhere. There were all kinds of beggars. There were permanent beggars and floating beggars. I mean, there were beggars that belonged to the doorway. You'd see them there for years, and they each did something or other. There was one man who'd always knock his head on the sidewalk, and I remember he horrified me because he had this callus like a dinner plate in the middle of his forehead. But they were all Chinese, and the only time I ever saw a beggar that was a white man with blue eyes, it was a White Russian man. They had come down that low, you had to feel. So the British regarded being White Russian as being, you know, low class or whatever it was and so forth. It didn't matter what you were before. When you lost all of everything you had, that was it, you know. So,
have you ever gone back?
To where?
Shanghai?
No, I had the chance, and these groups have gone back. My son and his wife have gone back. But I never have, because I've gone back once. And well, I felt I was born there. I went back once, and I kind of felt that if it ever got its hooks on me again, it wouldn't let me go a third time. So I don't want to go back.
Do you know if the camp is gone?
Oh, no, it's still there. It's a school again. It's a middle school. Yeah.
Did your son go to the...
No, he didn't go to any place I knew. The only thing that he talked about was that they lost their way and went down a side street and came on some people getting ready to barbecue a dog, which Chinese will eat anything. So,
well,
right.
Thank you very much for coming in today. Now, you said, yeah, you have some, your mom wrote some recollections. Did she write that right when, at the time?
I don't know when she wrote it. Some of her way of doing it is rather abrupt, so I was going to just, you know.
Was your mom it sounds like your mom kind of was the head of the household in a way. Did she run the family?
Not really. I mean, in what sense would you say that she ran the family? My father was bossy. He, you know, it was a different way of things. Women had to be feminine. My mother, her looks meant everything to her because I think she felt that it mattered. That was how the women survived, the Russian women, on their looks. My mother had 3 sisters. 3 of the girls married Englishmen, 1 married an American. And when there were of her friends and so forth, many of them married well. They married English and Russian bankers. Well, this didn't go over so hot with the English women, who weren't as good looking. They tend to be toothy and also rather frumpy. In England, it's always the men who look very stylish. They have wonderful tailors and so forth. Upper-class English women, it's the in thing is to look slightly frumpy, like Queen Elizabeth. You know, it's the world's biggest frump as far as I'm concerned.
Having been to London, I understand what you're saying.